Hey everyone, this is Matthew, aka Sentient Number 6, and in this video I'm going to be going over atmosphere design for Forest and darkpsy. Going to talk about the serum patch and talking a little bit about the notes and chords that I tend to go for, getting a little bit into music theory as well. So here's the sound. Yeah, so there it is. It's a kind of ghostly pad sound, a little bit of an ominous choir kind of feeling to it. So let's get into Serum. So before we get into the oscillators and everything, I want to talk about polyphony real quick. So with any synth sound where you're going to be playing more than one note at a time, especially so if you're using unison voices, you want to keep an eye on your polyphony count. And this slider here is going to control the maximum number of polyphony voices that will be available to that synth patch. So you see, if I just play one note, I'm using 4 voices just from one note, and that's because I've got 2 unison voices happening on this oscillator, plus a single voice on oscillator B, and a single voice in the noise oscillator. So if I were to start playing like a 3-note chord, for instance, I'm using now 12 polyphony voices, and if I were to play a second chord right after this, so a second 3-note chord, you can see that it jumps up to 24 and then back down to 12. And this is because I have like a 2 1/3 second release on the sound. So there's some overlap from the first chord to the second. Basically the first chord is still ringing out when the second chord is played. And so if I didn't have enough polyphony voices, for instance, let's say I was limited to 8, right? So if I play the first chord, or actually, so 3 here. So the first chord is going to come out just fine. But as soon as I jump to the second chord, you hear how the tail of the first chord just like disappears. So that's what we call like voice stealing. So in order to prevent that, you need to increase your polyphony count to something that will accommodate however many notes per chord you're going to be playing, given the number of voices that you're using in the synth patch. So, you know, if you're using like 5 unison voices here and 7 unison voices here, right, you're going to be using quite a lot of polyphony. Let's put this back to how it was, and let's get into the sound. So as with all the sounds I make in Serum, pretty much, most of the magic is happening in the modulations. So if we take a look at the main panel here, I'm using 2 stock Serum wavetables here and a stock Serum noise sound. So the first oscillator, if I take away the noise in oscillator B in the filter, is barely audible on its own. It's just kind of this like ghostly ringing. And it's got some stereo information because I've got these 2 unison voices that are spread pretty wide, and the width of the detuned voices is being modulated by this first LFO. So really, this first oscillator is just kind of giving me some stereo width. You'll also notice that it's 2 octaves lower than the MIDI notes I'm actually playing, and that was just something I dialed in by ear. Didn't want to go too low. I feel like I'm kind of losing some resolution when I go that low. And then up here sounds a bit too digital, ringy kind of sound. So right here sounds kind of like a good spot for this kind of like bass layer bed kind of part of the sound. And so oscillator B is the one that's carrying the majority of the tonal character of the sound. It's a pretty simple kind of like a acid kind of waveform, I guess. If you're playing like a single note riff, right, you get kind of like an acid sound when you're going through the wavetable position. And so the same LFO that was controlling the detune spread on the first oscillator is controlling the wavetable position over here. And so yeah, this is just filling in the spectrum of the sound, making it so that when I play chords, I can actually hear the individual notes coming through in the chord. And then the last layer is this noise. So the noise oscillator in Serum is super versatile. For the sake of this sound, I'm using a stock noise, but one of the coolest things about Serum is that you can actually use any wave file you want as a noise. And so what I've done is that for a lot of other sounds that I make, I've got a few like field recordings that are just like kind of nature sounds that I like to blend in. So for instance, here's a woodland field recording. So you can hear like those crickets in there, and you can control the pitch, you can control like random phase. So this is a super handy tool for creating really foresty atmospheres. This is like probably the #1 tip I can say is just like find a sample pack or a library full of nature field recordings and start throwing those into your pad sounds, because you're going to get a lot of mileage out of that. It creates some really cool results. So for this sound, I had this up to 7, I believe. So I'm just pitching up this this dark future noise and a little bit of random phase as well, so that every time you play a new note, the noise is going to start from a different point in the sample, just to add layers of randomness to the sound. And then the filter is really where a lot of the character is coming out in this sound here. So you can see I've got A, B, and the noise oscillator all routed into the filter. And I've got a decent amount of modulation happening on 3 different parameters here. So I've got this first LFO that was controlling the detune spread, the wavetable position, is now also controlling the formant modulation on this formant filter. I really like these formant filters in Serum because they add a very vocal quality to the sound, and especially with pads, I really like that sort of fake choir kind of sound. So I'm sort of going for that with this. Even if it's not overtly vocal, it has a bit of that character to it. So again, just really subtle movement. I rarely use synced LFOs. Now, as I say that, LFO2 here is synced to the mix, the dry-wet basically of the filter, just to kind of blend back and forth between like this vocal quality and more of a generic pad sound. And then the frequency cutoff, the cutoff frequency of the filter rather, is being controlled by this second envelope here. This is just to create some sort of aperiodic movement, so that it's not constantly cycling. It's gonna repeat the same kind of movement every time I play a new chord. A little bit of resonance, decent amount of drive. This is just to bring out the character of the filter. And yeah, not much else to be said about this front end of it. You know, typically with pads, you want to have a decent amount of attack and release on the amp envelope, just to kind of give it some blur, but from chord to chord, so it sounds more like a continuous sound, and you're not kind of chopping from one chord to the next. So let's take a look at the effects. I'm using the reverb filter in the effects section. I love this filter in Serum. It's super great for creating weird sounds. And you'll notice I've made an audio effect rack in Ableton just by, you know, if you take even just a single VST and hit Control G or Command G if you're on a Mac, you can group it into an audio effect rack, and then basically map any parameter from your VST to a macro, so that it's easy to access those parameters that you want to modulate later on when you're arranging your track. And so 2 of these macro knobs are for this reverb filter. I've got the dry wet, the mix, and I've got the cutoff frequency here. And so both of these are doing a lot of shaping if I move these around. And I do this because I tend to save everything. You know, if I make a patch like this, not only do I save it as a Serum preset, but I'll group it into an audio effect rack along with any plugins that I'm using to process the sound, and save that as an audio effect rack that I can go back and sorry, not audio effect rack. I think I've been saying that a bunch. I mean instrument rack. Yes, instrument rack. I've created a shortcut for it in my sidebar here, so that I can go through and like all these sounds are atmosphere sounds that I've made in different synths, and then grouped with plugins and macro controls, and saved for later use, so that when I go to make a track, I can just drag and drop sounds that I've already made. And I find that that lets me be a bit more creative with sound design in the moment. I'm not necessarily making sounds to fit within the context of a given track. I just sit down, open Ableton, and make a bunch of sounds and save them without really thinking about how I'll use them later. So anyway, a bit of a tangent, but back to the effects. So the EQ is just doing general EQ stuff, right? Taming some of the bass, you know, dialing back a bit of the high end so it's not too ringy, making it nice and mellow. I love the hyper dimension module in Serum for pads, especially the hyper side of it. I'm putting up the max unison voices here, and this is not actually going to contribute to your polyphony count down here. But like 7 unison voices at a high rate of modulation with a good amount of detune, right? It gives you this really chorused, underwater, like wobbling kind of sound on the pitch. So if I dial that back a bit, it's just a nice layer of stereo movement that I really enjoy in these kinds of pads. The dimension side of it isn't doing a whole lot. It's actually at 0, so yep, no need to even talk about it. It's not doing anything. And then reverb, you know, just pretty standard. I do have some modulation on the pre-delay here, and so if I move this manually, you can hear that sort of ocean waves kind of sound. And so I've got a little bit of movement with this 4th LFO, just sort of creating a bit of randomness and inconsistency in the reverb tail. Pretty wide, decent amount of damping and high cut, just because I don't want it to be super bright. These kinds of pads tend to sit behind all your leads and your hi-hats and stuff. They kind of more serve to like fill in the mid-range, I guess, of the track. A little bit of high end comes out too in the reverb tail, but we'll talk about that when we get to the processing. So one last thing I want to mention about the synth patch is LFO5 here is doing this kind of really jittery, erratic movement that's staying pretty close to the center line, and that's mapped to the global tuning of the synth. And so what this does is it creates instability in the pitch. And again, it's not very apparent because it's only set to 1 semitone. If I make this more wide, you can hear a much more obvious fluctuation of the pitch. And this sounds super cool as well, but for the sake of creating a pad that I would play musically, I would keep it to like 1 or 2 semitones so that the slight amount of movement that I have is only going to, you know, bend it by a couple of cents in either direction. So that about wraps it up for the patch. One thing to note is that I'm always using the 4x quality on this end of things. I like to keep it that way for the sake of sound design because very often I'll bounce things to audio and then chop them and sample them in tracks later on. Because a lot of the time, like laptops and just less expensive computers don't handle so many instances of Serum running lots of polyphony on the 4x quality. So yeah, let's take a look at the processing really quick, and then we'll talk about the notes and a bit of chord theory. So here's the Pro Q. All it's really doing is taking out the low end below about 150 hertz, kind of taming some mids, just shaping stuff in general. This band I might, you know, with Pro Q3 they added this dynamic EQ function so that only when this band is getting really sharp will it duck down. And I like doing that a lot. It kind of saves a step as opposed to having to grab like a multi-band dynamics and isolating this one band and then adjusting threshold, attack, and release within multi-band. Which, I mean, you can totally still do that if you don't have Pro Q3. I highly recommend that as opposed to just making a giant dip right in the mids because, you know, sometimes, right, because there's so much randomness in the sound, you won't always need such a big dip. So using some kind of dynamic EQ or just like a single band compression can help to achieve a cleaner and more transparent result as opposed to just, you know, taking a notch and just leaving it like that the whole time. And then this is just bringing up the highs, kind of accentuating the tail of the reverb. Not a whole lot else to say about that. And then just a little bit of Pro C to smooth out the dynamics. I think the ratio is, 4.5-ish Pretty generous attack and release. I'm not trying to. I'm trying to avoid any drastic shifts in volume with this. So this is really kind of just serving to tame the dynamics a bit. Nothing extreme as far as compression settings go. So let's talk a bit about notes in chords. So this track, this little demo loop that I'm using, the bass line is kind of oscillating between B and C. So I'm kind of going for this B Phrygian dominant feeling. So B being the root of the track, and then C being the second note of the scale. So if I pull up this little MIDI clip here, this is just the whole scale spelled out. So I've got, well, it sounds like this on solo. So it's a really common scale for darkpsy. It's pretty common in prog and full-on and Goa as well. It's really common in metal music, and that's kind of the school of thought that I'm coming from when it comes to writing chord progressions for darkpsy. Is I'm trying to think of like metal riffs essentially. I don't know how many of you listen to metal, but it's there's a lot of minor chords in this kind of music. So that's the second piece of this. So for those of you that know music theory, typically when we build chords, you're kind of doing a take a note, skip a note thing, right? Like for the first note of this key, you'd go 1, 3, 5. That would be your first triad. The second chord, 2, 4, 6. Then you have 3, 5, 7, and so on and so forth. And so you have all 7 chords. So we're not doing that for this example. What we're going to do is essentially build minor triads on every single note of the scale. So a minor triad essentially looks like this. You have the root note, then you're going to go 2, 3, 4. Sorry, 1 too high. There you go. So you have 3 steps up, and then the last note is going to be 7 steps from the root. And so basically what we can do is just take this block of notes, this triad shape, and move it so that the root note goes on to each note of this scale. And by itself, that doesn't sound very good. But if you take just 2 chords or 3 chords and then rearrange the notes so that they're spread out across multiple octaves, you get a much more interesting effect. So let's take a look at this. So this is just the first 2 minor triads that we did over here. So B and C minor. And these are just like what we call the root position triads. So that the root note, B and C, is the lowest note. Then you have the third and the fifth. So everything just moves up a half step. So this by itself, right, it's usable. It sounds pretty dark and spooky and ominous. And so if you wanted, you could just stop there, right? You know, minor chords moving around based on the scale that you started with. It's kind of like level 1. So this one that I just moved up, this would be based on the third note being D sharp in this example. So here's D sharp, and then the same minor chord shape. So what I like to do is take it a step further and start spreading the notes out. So you can see here, this is still B minor and C minor, but what I've done is I've taken the notes and spread them out across different octaves. So in Ableton, if you select a note and you hold the shift key and press either up arrow or down arrow, you're going to jump an octave in the MIDI, the piano roll here. And so what I like to do is spread these notes out across octaves, and this is going to create a much more orchestral feeling, and it's going to create contrary motion between the notes. So rather than every single note moving up 1 semitone, we're going to have 1 note moving up a semitone, 1 note moving down 2 semitones, and 1 note moving up 4 semitones. And this creates a much more complex sort of movement from chord to chord, even though it's still technically the same 3 notes as the first example. And to me, I prefer this kind of sound for like a musical setting. The first example, right, I might use this for like an intro, or like if I'm making something more like kind of cinematic sounding and I just want some murky bed underneath a bunch of other sounds, something like this would totally work. And so just for the sake of more examples, this third MIDI clip is B minor to G minor. So I'm taking a triad based on the first note of the scale and then the sixth note of the scale. If I go back over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. G is the sixth note of the scale. So I'm taking these notes, G, A sharp, and D. There's D sharp. Sorry, did I mess this up? Oh no, I'm looking at the wrong clip. Haha. G, A sharp, and D. Yeah, G, D, A sharp. Cool. We're all good. And so it's the same concept where I've got the voices spread out, and you notice that it's a bit wider, and I actually have a common tone between these two chords. So this is one of the more like traditional rules of like harmony and just basic music theory, is that when you have a chord progression, you almost always want to try to keep common notes between the chords the same. So like static movement or no movement at all in this middle voice, and then we have contrary motion in the two outer voices. So this sounds like this. So yeah, pretty nice. You know, it's just we have, you know, 1 to 2 progression, a 1 to 6 progression. And now this last example is a bit more complex. So the first thing you might notice is that I have 10 bars in this loop, and have like this is just something that I think is really great, not just for atmospheres but for leads as well. If you have patterns in your track that are not based on 4, and then you impose them over your typical like 4, 8, 16, 32 kind of structure, so that you get loops repeating in different places, right? If I have an 8-bar loop under this, so let's maybe add the hi-hats back in just for all the whole track, fine. So here's 4 bars, and here's 8 bars. So normally, right, you would just go back to the beginning here, but adding this extra chord kind of offsets the cycle of the atmosphere loop relative to the kick, bass, and hi-hat loops. So doing this gives a much more linear sound to your track, as opposed to it being extremely obvious to the listener that everything is repeating every 4 bars or every 8 bars. So as far as the chords I'm using, this is still B minor, C minor, B minor, right? So the first clip that we were using. And then this chord is still based on C minor, right? If I were to take this and copy it over, oops, too big. Take this, copy it over. What I did is I just took this note and then dropped it down here, because as I was writing this loop, my ear was telling me, hey, like it would sound cool if the melody went like, having that note come down there. So this creates something that's not a minor triad anymore. We have A sharp, D, and D sharp. So these two notes, being D and D sharp, they're only you know, 1 semitone apart. The fact that we're spreading it across 2 separate octaves creates some really nice tension, and we get to keep this cool little melody thing in the top. And then this last chord is E minor, so it's based on the 4th note of our scale that we started with. So all together, yeah, we have this nice kind of hypnotic atmosphere rhythm going on. And so from here, like if I were to want to keep this and work with this in a track, I would start to add some modulation, right? So because I made those macro controls earlier in the instrument rack, I have access to those parameters that I might want to modulate within here. So I'm not going to draw in any automation right now. With Live 10, it's pretty simple to just like drag kind of like a random selection and then just insert like a shape like that. All right, that's a bit extreme, but you get the point that at this point you could start drawing in automation from whatever macros that you've set up for yourself. So one last point that I want to make about this regarding notes is that when I was talking about uneven rhythms, another aspect of that is, not making every chord last for 2 bars, right? I can make this chord last for 1.5, make this guy longer there, make both of these, or make this one that long, make this one here, right? So you see what I'm doing? I'm just making it a bit more unpredictable in terms of when the chords are going to change. I don't know how this is going to sound, but something like this might sound a bit better if the sound weren't so obviously melodic, right? If I had something, more like these chords where the notes are much closer together and the overall sound is a bit muddier, that might be something preferable. So yeah, a lot of the time, atmospheres like this are really hard to run in the context of a whole project. So one thing that I highly recommend doing is, I drag this over to arrangement view, make a new audio track, and I automatically set everything to resampling when I make a new audio track because this is super handy. If I record enable that, I can really easily record this atmosphere. Let it tail out. Cool. And then it's simple enough to Ableton's locking up a bit. Well, anyways, I can just, okay, here it goes. So if I make a new track, MIDI track with simpler, you might want to like rename this Atmo 1 or whatever. I highly recommend a better naming scheme than that. But if you like drag it into your sample library or whatever, it'll copy like a whole folder in here. So it's doing its thing. So there it is. It makes a clip like this. But then if I go to the samples, recorded, so there's the actual thing, the actual sample, right? And so saving samples like that, super, super useful because then you can make a simpler, drag that audio back in there. And if you go to slice mode, let's say slice by region or whatever, then you can make different slices from that sample that you just recorded. And so now each of these slices is assigned to a different MIDI key. Adding fade in, fade out. And you also have transpose available to you there. So that was a bit quick and dirty how I did it there. I might, normalize this gain-wise, take a bit more time to adjust where these split markers are, just to give myself something that's a bit more playable. But that's really cool because if you tag this with the key and tempo that you used, it's really easy to transfer these kinds of atmospheres into any track and then just adjust, let's say like this was in B Phrygian dominant. If I was making a track in C minor or something, it would be easy enough for me to just use this transpose knob to adjust for whatever key I'm in and even modulate this using automation to create different chords than what I recorded in the first place. So yeah, this video is a bit long-winded now, getting close to half an hour, but I hope it was helpful. Please feel free to leave any comments below. I'm going to upload that serum patch in the description. And yeah, I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.